Ma'am, I think you're looking for the auxiliary supply closet. This is the primary trauma cart. It's restricted for attending physicians and certified trauma nurses during a code. The voice was young, crisp, and saturated with an unearned confidence that grated on the ears like sand in a gearbox. Dr. Julian Croft, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass and his eyes the color of a winter sky, gestured with a pen toward a door down the hall. He didn't look up from the chart he was annotating, the motion a dismissive flick of the wrist. Standing before him was Alara Finch. To the casual observer, she was a woman whose edges had been softened by time. Her hair, a tidy silver bun, seemed to capture the harsh fluorescent light of the ER and gentle it. Her uniform, though immaculately clean, was worn at the collar and cuffs, a testament to years of service. She stood with a stillness that was often misinterpreted as slowness, a quiet gravity in a place defined by frantic motion. She didn't respond to Croft's redirection. Her gaze was fixed on the cart, her eyes cataloging its contents with an unnerving focus. She noted the placement of the intubation tray, the neatly bundled packs of chest tubes, the specific arrangement of the cardiac drugs. One of her hands rested on the stainless steel surface, her fingers long and pale, the knuckles raised and crisscrossed with a fine silvery web of old scars. Dr. Croft finally looked up, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Ilara, did you hear me? Triage is getting backed up. Your talents would be better utilized there." The words were coated in a thin veneer of professional courtesy, but the message underneath was clear. You are old. You are slow. You are in the way. The younger residents and nurses orbiting Croft's brilliant, demanding son exchanged subtle glances. They'd all seen this before. Croft, the wonderkind surgeon who could pluck life from the jaws of death, had little patience for those he deemed relics of a bygone medical era. And to him, Alara Finch, with her quiet demeanor and her refusal to be hurried, was the most prominent fossil in his museum. She finally lifted her eyes from the cart and met his gaze. There was no anger in them, no resentment, just a calm, steady assessment that seemed to see right through his starched white coat and into the frantic, ambitious heart beating beneath it. "The Celox packets are stored below the quick clot," she said, her voice soft but clear. "In a massive hemorrhage, you'll want the Celox first for a deep cavitational wound. It generates less heat. You'll save yourself 3 seconds and maybe prevent a secondary burn. Just a thought, doctor." She turned without waiting for a reply and walked toward the triage desk, her worn orthopedic shoes making no sound on the polished linoleum. Croft stared after her, his jaw tight. He hated when she did that. Pointed out some minuscule detail, some obscure fact from a field manual he'd never read, and then just walked away, leaving him feeling strangely diminished. He glanced at the cart, then quickly looked away, a faint flush creeping up his neck. The day wore on, a typical rhythm of chaos for a level 1 trauma center. A concert goer with a substance-induced psychosis, a construction worker who had fallen 2 stories, a child with a severe asthma attack. Through it all, Dr. Croft was a whirlwind of decisive action, his orders sharp and precise, his hands a blur of life-saving motion. He was brilliant, and he knew it. He moved through the ER like a shark, all forward momentum, leaving a wake of stabilized patients and awestruck residents. Alara, meanwhile, operated on a different frequency. She was the calm center of the storm. She was the one who held the hand of the terrified wife whose husband was being shocked back to life. She was the one who noticed the faint petechial rash on a feverish child that everyone else had missed, leading to an early sepsis diagnosis. She was the one who spoke in low, soothing tones to the dementia patient who kept trying to pull out his IV lines, calming him when pharmaceuticals and restraints had failed. Ben Carter, a senior paramedic with 15 years on the job and another 10 as an Army combat medic before that, watched her as he handed off a patient. He saw things others didn't. He saw the way she stood, her weight perfectly balanced, never leaning, always ready to move. He saw the way her eyes never stopped scanning, the monitors, the patients, the doorways, the people. It was a classic sentry's gaze, a state of relaxed awareness that couldn't be taught. He'd seen that look in the eyes of seasoned NCOs in the dusty chaos of Kandahar. He suspected there was a deep, untold story behind Alara Finch, but he was professional enough to keep his curiosity to himself. He just gave her a respectful nod whenever he saw her, a gesture she always returned with a small, quiet smile. The storm broke just before the evening shift change. Not a meteorological one, but a man-made tempest of metal and glass. A tanker truck had jackknifed on the interstate overpass during rush hour, triggering a 20-car pileup in the rain-slicked chaos below. The call came in, and the calm of the ER evaporated. The overhead speakers crackled to life. Mass casualty incident, code triage, all available staff to the emergency bay. Dr. Croft's eyes lit up with a fierce predatory gleam. This was his element. This was where gods of medicine were forged. "All right, people, listen up," he barked, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "I want 3 trauma bays prepped for red tags, bay 4 for yellow. Miller, you're on airway. Chen, you're on circulation. I want a running tally of blood products from the bank every 5 minutes. Let's move, people." This is not a drill. He was magnificent, a general marshaling his troops for battle. The staff scrambled to obey, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and adrenaline. Alara was already at the main supply closet, pulling down extra chest tubes and IO drill kits, her movements economical and swift. She laid them out on a gurney with the precision of a surgeon preparing her instruments. Croft, in his pre-battle briefing, decided a bit of gallows humor was in order to cut the tension. He pointed to his chest. "I'm Trauma 1. Let's use call signs to keep the comms clear. Keeps things simple. Chen, your ortho god. Ben," he said, clapping the newly arrived paramedic on the shoulder, "you can be medic prime." Some of the younger nurses chuckled nervously. His eyes scanned the room and landed on Alara, who was checking the charge on a defibrillator. A smirk played on his lips. "And Alara, what's your call sign? The archivist? Bedside manner? Come on, give us something." The air grew thick with a sudden, uncomfortable silence. The joke landed with a thud. Alara didn't look up from her task. She placed the paddles back on the machine, the click echoing in the quiet room. Croft, misinterpreting her silence as meekness, pressed on, his arrogance blinding him. "Every old soldier has a war story and a nickname. What was yours back in the day? Grandma Nightingale?" A few sycophantic residents forced a laugh. Ben Carter's face hardened. He knew that tone. It was the sound of a lieutenant, fresh from the academy, mocking a grizzled master sergeant. It was a mistake that was often paid for in blood. "Doctor," Ben said, his voice low and tight, "maybe we should just stick to our names." But Croft waved him off. "Nonsense, a little team building. What's it going to be, Alara?" The first sirens were screaming in the distance now, growing closer with every passing second. Alara finally looked at him. Her face was a placid mask, but her eyes held a depth of weariness that seemed as old as the world itself. She said nothing. The wail of the sirens was almost upon them. The first ambulance slammed to a halt at the bay doors. The doors burst open. Chaos had arrived. The first gurney carried a man in his 40s, his body a mangled ruin of broken bones and torn flesh. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Croft was on him in an instant. "Massive thoracic trauma. Get me a chest tube, now. Page the OR. Tell them we have an aortic dissection coming up hot." His hands were a blur, assessing, commanding, working. But the patient was circling the drain. His pressure was dropping like a stone, the monitor emitting a high, panicked shriek. 2 more gurneys followed. A woman, conscious but impaled by a piece of rebar, and a young boy, maybe 7, with a severe head injury. The ER descended into a controlled pandemonium. Amid the cacophony of beeping machines, shouted orders and cries of pain, Ben Carter was trying to coordinate the incoming flow of patients with the hospital's limited resources. He needed a central point of contact, a calm voice to direct the flow. His eyes found Alara. She wasn't frantic. She was moving through the chaos with a serene purpose, applying a tourniquet to the impaled woman's leg to slow the bleeding, speaking to her in a low, calming voice, her hands impossibly steady. Ben keyed his radio. He needed a designation for her, something to tell the other paramedics. "Nurse Finch," he called out, his voice strained over the noise. "I need a call sign for the command log. What is it?" Croft's patient was coding. "He's in V-fib, charging to 200 clear." The body on the table jumped. The monitor blared a flatline. "No response. Pushing one of EPI. Start compressions." Croft was losing him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his confidence beginning to fray at the edges. In that moment of supreme crisis, with the sound of the flatline tone filling the room like a death knell, Alara looked up from the woman she was treating. Her gaze swept over Croft's desperate efforts, her eyes missing nothing. She saw the distended veins in the dying man's neck, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of his trachea to the left. It was a sign Croft, in his focus on the heart, had completely missed. She turned her head and met Ben Carter's desperate gaze. The world seemed to slow down, the shouting, the beeping, the frantic motion. It all faded into a dull roar. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it sliced through the chaos with the chilling precision of a scalpel. It was low, devoid of emotion, and carried the weight of 100 storms weathered in silence. Silent storm. For a full second, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Ben Carter froze, the radio handset halfway to his mouth. His face, already pale with stress, turned the color of ash. The name didn't just register, it detonated in his memory. Silent storm. It wasn't a call sign, it was a ghost story, a legend whispered by medics in the FOBs of Afghanistan and Iraq. It was the name given to a shadowy figure from the JSOC world, a female flight nurse attached to a Tier 1 unit back in the 90s. The stories were apocryphal, larger than life. They said she could perform a thoracotomy in the back of a Black Hawk during a firefight. They said she pioneered techniques in remote damage control resuscitation that were now standard practice, written into the manuals he had studied. They said she had been in Mogadishu, on the ground, and had kept a dozen wounded Rangers alive for 17 hours with little more than morphine and sheer force of will. They said she had vanished after that, retired, disappeared into myth. Ben's eyes darted to Alara's hands, to the web of scars on her knuckles. He saw it now. Not the frail hands of an old woman, but the hands of someone who had held life together with pressure and prayer in the darkest places on earth. Across the bay, Dr. Alistair Reed, a semi-retired anesthesiologist who had served as a MASH surgeon in Vietnam, slowly lowered the chart he was holding. His eyes, usually clouded with cynical detachment, were wide with a sudden profound recognition. He, too, had heard the stories. The ER hadn't just gone quiet. It had gone still with a sudden electric reverence. Alara paid their shock no mind. The legend was irrelevant. The patient was dying. She moved with a speed that defied her age, a blur of focused intent. She arrived at Croft's side, her presence radiating an authority that eclipsed his own. "Doctor, stop compressions," she commanded. Her voice was quiet, but it was the quiet of a breaking glacier. It was absolute. Stunned, Croft instinctively obeyed. "You have a tension pneumothorax. You're pumping against a collapsed lung and a constricted heart. You're killing him faster." She didn't wait for his permission. Her hand shot out to the cart she had inspected earlier. "Give me a 14-gauge angiocath and a chlorhexidine swab." A young nurse, her eyes wide, slapped them into her waiting palm. Alara tore open the packaging with her teeth. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. She swabbed the man's chest, her fingers finding the landmark with unerring accuracy. With a single fluid motion, she plunged the long needle into his chest. There was a soft pop, followed by a distinct audible hiss of escaping air. On the monitor, the flatline sputtered, then jumped into a weak but steady sinus rhythm. The blood pressure reading, which had been non-existent, flickered to life, 70/40. It was low, but it was there. He was back. The entire room stared, breathless. "Doctor." Julian Croft looked from the now stable monitor to the needle in the patient's chest, and then to the old woman standing beside him. His face was a mask of disbelief and dawning, gut-wrenching shame. She wasn't finished. She turned from the man on the table, her mind already triaging the entire room. "Dr. Croft, get him prepped for a chest tube and then to the OR, Dr. Reed," she said, her voice locking onto the older anesthesiologist. "I need you to manage his airway. He'll be unstable." "Ben," she called to the paramedic, who was still standing frozen. "The woman with the impalement. The rebar is acting as a plug. Do not remove it. Start 2 large-bore IVs and hang plasma. We'll take her to surgery second. The boy with the head injury," she pointed. "Get him to CT now. His right pupil is blown. We have a brain bleed." She wasn't shouting. She wasn't frantic. She was simply the calm, undeniable center of gravity around which the entire chaotic universe of the ER had now begun to orbit. She was conducting a symphony of survival, and every person in the room, doctors, nurses, residents, became her willing instruments. They moved not out of fear, but out of a sudden instinctive recognition of true competence, of a mastery so profound it felt like a force of nature. For the next hour, she moved between patients, her quiet voice directing the flow, her steady hands assisting, teaching, and correcting. She showed a young resident how to properly apply a pelvic binder, explaining the biomechanics of a shear fracture. She walked Croft himself through the insertion of the chest tube, her guidance firm but gentle, correcting his hand position, forcing him to focus on the patient, not his own shattered ego. Slowly, inevitably, the storm passed. The last of the critical patients was wheeled out to the ICU, or the operating room. The cacophony subsided, replaced by the weary hum of a unit that had been pushed to its limit and held. The floors were stained with blood and littered with the debris of life-saving efforts. Dr. Julian Croft stood leaning against the main nurse's station, his shoulders slumped. The starched white coat seemed to hang off him, his arrogance stripped away, leaving behind a hollowed-out young man staring into the abyss of his own ignorance. He watched as Alara Finch, the woman he had dismissed as a relic, moved through the room with a trash bag, quietly cleaning up, wiping down a countertop, restoring order to the chaos she had tamed. Her movements were the same as they had been that morning, calm, deliberate, unassuming. It was as if nothing had happened. Croft pushed himself off the counter and walked over to her, his expensive shoes feeling heavy as lead. He stopped a few feet away, searching for words that felt utterly inadequate. "How?" was all he could manage to choke out. "Where did you learn to do that?" Alara finished wiping down the counter before she turned to him. She looked at his exhausted, humbled face, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than placid calm in her eyes. It was a deep, abiding sorrow, the look of someone who had paid an unimaginable price for her knowledge. "In a crisis, doctor," she said softly, her voice carrying no trace of triumph. "You don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training." She picked up her bag to leave, her shift long since over. As she walked toward the exit, Ben Carter passed her. He stopped, turned, and faced her. He didn't speak. He simply brought his hand up in a slow, perfect salute. It was a gesture of such profound respect that it seemed to sanctify the tired, blood-spattered space of the ER. Alara paused, met his eyes, and gave him a single, solemn nod of acknowledgement. Then, she was gone. The next morning, Dr. Julian Croft walked into the office of the Chief of Medicine and formally requested that Nurse Alara Finch be promoted to Head of Trauma Nursing Education, with her protocols to be made mandatory for all emergency staff. Later that day, he found her in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone, stirring a cup of tea. He approached her table, not as a doctor, but as a supplicant. He sat down, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he looked at her, his expression stripped of all its former pride. "The things you did, the things you knew," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They don't teach that in medical school." Alara looked down at the scarred knuckles of her own hand, then back at him. "No," she agreed quietly. "They don't." Croft took a deep breath, the question feeling like the most important of his life. "Will you teach me?" Alara Finch looked at the brilliant, broken young doctor, and for the second time, she offered him a small, quiet smile. This one, however, was different. It was the smile of a teacher who had finally found a student worthy of the lesson. She gave a single, slow nod. The storm was over, but the learning was just beginning.